Yeah, right. It should just send you out. It should record. Are we on? Okay. The only person that I know is logged in is you. Oh, that's good. Where's Cal? Cal here? Okay. Let's see Cal before. Ken Davis asked for the link. What situation? Does anybody know where Callum is? Is Callum coming? He's supposed to be here. Nobody knows. You live with him. You should know everything about that, what that man is doing. Okay. Well, I know that Callum's really interested in your talk, so hopefully he'll show up. All right, maybe we'll get started. Welcome to Tony Buda. We are just, I'm going to tell people, some of you guys know all this, but Tony doesn't know it, and sometimes Tony knows things that you don't know, so just bear with me. This semester, we're having talks partly or mostly by people that are not officially in the CZO, partly because we anticipate the National Science Foundation is going to publish a request for proposals at any moment, and we will then be ready to write our CZO renewal. And one of the things that we have thought is a shame is that on campus we have the U.S. Department of Agriculture Pasture Lab, which is led by Peter Kleinman, and this is where Tony Buda works. He's a hydrologist in the Pasture Lab. It's just right over there, in essence. And the USDA-Pasture Lab runs a long-term agricultural research observatory, an LTAR. And in other CZOs around the country, a local LTAR works hand in glove with the CZO, but we've never really done that here. And so one of the things we were doing this semester was kind of exploring what goes on at the LTAR and what the Pasture Lab is doing and how we might interact with them. So Tony is the hydrologist that works at the LTAR, and he graciously decided or agreed to talk with us about this. So that's kind of the background. Just to go into the little nuts and bolts CZO announcements, we have a field team meeting scheduled for 1:30 on Wednesday this week in 117 EES building. That's for the team that goes out in the field and takes all the measurements. We have a seminar of interest on Thursday, this Thursday at 3:30, also in 117 EES. It's called NEON, Open Access Data to Understand Our Changing Ecosystems. What is the speaker's name for that, Jennifer? Erica Howitt, and she's yeah, Erica Howitt is with NEON. And NEON is I don't know what NEON stands for. It's an Ecological Observatory Network, National Ecological Observatory Network. It's across the whole country, and we have a GSI alum who actually works there about with the data, and so that should be a great talk. AGU is coming up. For those of you that are going to AGU, get your presentation details to Jennifer. There will be a booth at AGU for CZO people, and you can sign up. It's actually kind of fun to sit at the booth because it gives you something to do sometimes when you just want to sit down and relax, and a lot of people come talk to you. There's also a town hall for critical zone observatories at AGU, and then the institute that I'm the director of runs a reception. Do you go to AGU, Tony?
Yeah, periodically, yeah.
Are you going this year? Are you going this year? Okay. Well, every year the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute does a reception at AGU, and you know, it's paid for by the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences, but I try to invite everybody that I know is going from Penn State, but of course I don't know everybody. So if you're going to AGU and want to get invited to the party, email me and I'll put you on the list, because I think it's Thursday. It's changed from one year to last year. AGU was in New Orleans and it was a great party, let me tell you. Some of it has to do with the venue. I don't know about DC, but it's in the restaurant called the Baby Whale this year. And then finally, the next seminar in the series is Monday, November 12 at noon, again back over in 117 EES building. Are there any other announcements for the Go to the?
I think is Monday what is scheduled for the soil coring at Cole Farm.
Oh yeah. Can you tell us about the soil coring at Cole Farm? This is for the people that are on the webinar. Doesn't magnify your voice.
Yeah, so on a Monday, November 5th, we're doing a soil coring out at the farm, and it'll be up between the two east and west mid slopes. They're doing 5 or 6 soil cores up there with mountain research from Altoona. We'll be out there all day on Monday.
Any other announcements? All right, so we're going to turn it over to Tony. He's going to talk to us about kind of in broad, writ broad, like what they've been working on in terms of their observatory work. And we're kind of thinking that this might kick off ways that there could be more interactions between CZO and your work here. So welcome.
Okay, thanks, Sue, and thanks so much for inviting me to come talk to you all today. So I'm mostly focusing on the role of hydrology, and I'm going to fixate on phosphorus. I do work in nitrogen too, but I have a lot of slides on phosphorus that I was able to pull together for this. I'm going to mostly focus on our work on phosphorus up and down the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we do work in the upper part of the watershed, sloping landscapes, and also down on the eastern shore of Maryland, where we have flat landscapes and artificial drainage. So I'll give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the things that we've been doing in those places. Firstly, though, I'll just give you a little bit of a description of the lab for those of you who aren't familiar with the Pasture Systems and Watershed Management Research Unit. The Pasture Lab actually started in 1937 on campus. You can see, here's this is the laser. Anyway, it's on the far left. I don't know which one's the laser. But anyway, you can see the building. It's the same building across the street from the creamery, but nothing around it. So we've been here for quite a while. Penn State kind of built up around us.
And I was going to say, I meant to say that Tony actually works for the federal government, and I think the geologists don't actually understand that we have a little piece of the federal government, like right on our campus.
Yeah, there's a couple. I mean, the USGS as the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Unit is also here. National Park Service is here. So there's a couple of federal entities here on campus that interface with grad students and research. So yeah, so the Pasture Lab is 1937. Then there was in 1966, USDA formed the Watershed Research Centers as a Northeast Watershed Research Center that came into being, and they were actually close to the Land and Water Building. That's where they were located. And then the two, I'll wait till this, there we go. That's okay. Technology. That's okay. That was actually my fault. I should know not to touch anything on my slideshow. Okay, we're good? Yeah, so in 66, we had the Northeast Watershed Research Center. Those two entities came together in 92, and so that's now with the watershed groups and the pasture groups aligned in this building, the Pasture Lab across the street. And now we kind of have a 3 CRIS structure. CRISs are like research groups, basically. And so there's a group in our lab that does research on grazing lands and pasture systems. There's a group that I'm a part of that Ray Bryant leads, Pete Kleinman's in that group, Kurt Dell, and Clint Church with research on water quality. And there's a farming systems group, which is kind of integrates the two fields, research groups, the grazing lands groups and the water quality group, and they do a lot of farm systems modeling. Al Rotz leads that group, and Tammy Beath is a part of that group too. She's a watershed modeler, uses SWOT, does a lot of optimization research, looking at where's the best place in a watershed to put BMPs to optimize water quality benefits. So those are the 3 groups that are there. Actually, in 2012, we actually added another group that does research on cranberry systems. And so we have a collaborator, Casey Kennedy, who's also a hydrologist and does a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus work. He's up in Amherst, or actually East Wareham, but he's affiliated with the Cranberry Station, and they're run by University of Massachusetts Amherst. And so they became a part of our group in 2012. So here's kind of what it looks like, and you can see the various places where we're working. Most of it's part of this LTAR, which I'll talk about in a second. And those are the 4 basins that you see in the upper Chesapeake. We also work in the Minokan River Basin, which I'll show some results of work that we've done down there. That's on the Delmarva, and you can see where Casey and his group is located in Wareham. Did we lose it again? Oh, not again. Do you want me to wait or keep going? Excuse me. Yeah. Yeah. click on that one. That's just that's the slideshow without the, yeah, that's not. There you go, that one. Sorry, technology. It fails us in field research too, so sometimes.
Maybe just drag that to this screen. Is it on your screen right now? There's only one screen that has it. I'll drag that to there. Drag that to there. Try this. There we go.
Just click on that. Yeah. Just get through this. Yes, just let me know if anybody doesn't see it. Okay, so just this is kind of like where a lot of our work occurs, at least in the the context of the Upper Chesapeake Bay, and then also the folks who do cranberry research, Casey Kennedy and his technician Sophie, are pictured here on the right. They do a lot of work in cranberry systems, and so that's kind of the breadth of where we're working. We're part of, as Sue mentioned, we're part of a national network now, which is the USDA's LTAR network, so it's Long-Term Agro-Ecosystem Research Network. It started off as 10 sites nationally, so these were funded by an act of Congress, and we were part of the original 10, the Upper Chesapeake Bay, and then they added just recently 8 more sites, and they're talking about adding another site in California to bring the total to 19, because California is underrepresented right now. So there will be eventually 19 sites spanning most of the major agriculture regions of the U.S. We're here in the Upper Chesapeake Bay, and so this is what our LTAR looks like. We've got 4 watersheds that we propose to work in that span the physiography of the Upper Chesapeake. So the Anderson Creek is in the Allegheny Plateau, Spring Creek, which is where we're kind of situated here in the Ridge and Valley, the karst region of the Ridge and Valley. Mantango Creek in Clingerstown, PA, that's where we've done the bulk of our work to date. It's the longest running of the 4. It started in 1968, so that's where we've done the lion's share of our research. Most of these other basins are fairly new. And then Conawago Creek down in Elizabethtown, where Penn State's had a lot of activity. And so we've kind of picked that because it was an NRCS showcase watershed. Penn State has a lot of interest in doing research there. And so that was a natural 4th place to work. And it's in the Piedmont. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is going to focus on sloping landscapes, and a lot of that work is going to come out of Clingerstown, the Mantango Creek watershed, where we've done a lot of our research. I'll try to give you a little bit of background on phosphorus loss and water quality. Then I'll kind of get into the role of hydrology and phosphorus loss from sloped lands, so sloping landscapes. A lot of this is a picture of one of the watersheds in Mantango Creek. And then some of the work that we've been doing more recently in coastal plain settings down on the eastern shore of Maryland. And so I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but eutrophication, as you all know, is kind of a persistent global problem. Despite decades of watershed conservation efforts, we still are faced with a lot of regions around the world where we have eutrophication issues, coastal and freshwater. So lots of money has been invested in the farm bills, where conservation measures that are largely targeting applied pea sources. This would be like applied fertilizers, applied manures. And then you can look around even just in the U.S. and find recent examples, where we've had persistent eutrophication problems in Lake Erie. So this is a re-eutrophication story where now they solved kind of the particulate phosphorus problem, by changing from tilling to no-till, but there's still a lot of dissolved phosphorus losses and tile drainage. And so that So even though total phosphorus has gone down and and decreasing particulate P has been the big part of that story, there's been an uptick in dissolved phosphorus losses, and that's what's in part caused the reeutrophication of Lake Erie. We still have persistent issues in the Chesapeake Bay, and even in the Gulf of Mexico. All that's more of a nitrogen story than a phosphorus story, but phosphorus still plays a role. You can look at work that's been done just trying to characterize what's the natural background levels of phosphorus in waters. Largely they're fairly low, but you can go to places like the eastern shore of Maryland and find that even in base flows we can have 2 parts per million of phosphorus coming out of drainage ditches. And so this is just a function of just the intensity of the agriculture that's being done in certain parts of the country. And so this is a map showing regional phosphorus imbalances across the country. And those are largely tied to areas of intensive livestock production. And so oftentimes wherever the livestock are being grown, that's where the nutrients are being applied. And so you have this buildup of phosphorus in soils. And so, locally you can see Lancaster County stands out as an area where we have a lot of legacy phosphorus. The eastern shore of Maryland, where we do quite a bit of work, Shenandoah Valley, and then elsewhere across the country where you have either dairy production or swine or poultry. Excuse me. It's not just a national problem, so legacy phosphorus is a global problem, and Graham McDonald actually did a really nice study showing just where around the world you have these areas of legacy phosphorus buildup in soils. And so you got the coastal regions in the U.S., eastern Brazil, Western Europe, and eastern China show up as areas where we have just substantial amounts of phosphorus buildup in soil due to continuous application of manures and fertilizers. And so what happens is oftentimes, the phosphorus is building up right there at the surface. And Andrew Sharpley coined this term, the effective depth of interaction. And so this is just this couple centimeters near the surface of the soil where phosphorus concentrations are the highest, and often that's where your interflow is occurring and overland flow. And so it's interacting with those high P soils, and that's what leads to phosphorus loss in runoff. Pete Vadas published a meta-analysis of just runoff box studies where they're just using simple 20 centimeter by half a meter boxes basically packed with soil, different phosphorus concentrations, and shows this really nice relationship of dissolved phosphorus in runoff versus the Mehlich 3 available phosphorus in soils. And so as soil P goes up, the amount of phosphorus in runoff goes up. That's basically what is shown there. So with that, kind of as introduction or a little bit of background, I'll kind of focus on a little bit of some of the work that we've done over the time that I've been with the lab on phosphorus loss in sloping landscapes. And so a lot of that's been done. Here we are at Penn State, and here's the Mantango Creek Experimental Watershed. So that's east central Pennsylvania. Klingerstown is the largest metropolitan area. It's like 50 or maybe 100 people might live there, but you wouldn't notice it if you drove through it. But mostly where we've done our work is in this W38 watershed, which is in the north central part of Mantango Creek. And most of what I'll show you comes out of these 2 small subcatchments of FT36 and Mattern. So FT36 is 40 hectares and Mattern's 11. When I first got here, there was a lot of interest in the role of different runoff generation mechanisms and what restrictive layers like fragipans, like the role that they play in generating runoff from these landscapes. And so predating me, they had, they've been looking at some of these issues, where you've got well-drained soils in the upslope regions, and then poorly drained soils like a fragipan or an argillic horizon, something that perches water and can cause persistent saturation. And so we have these soil features throughout the watershed. For a period of time, they've been sending technicians out, doing something called the wet boot method, which you'll see published in the literature, actually. And so just walking around the GPS unit and surveying saturated areas several times, a month or sometimes multiple times in a season at least. And so you can see some of the results that we get from this. Here's one from August of 2003 when these guys were out, and you can see disconnected saturated areas. But as you progress through the fall, as things wet up, these saturated areas connect, and now you have connected surface saturation that, for rainfall event came around this time that you'd produce, more in the way of overland flow runoff. This is kind of what this looks like. This is actually moving north into the FT36 watershed. So if you actually looked at what these variably saturated areas look like, this is one picture that Andrew Sharpley took. It's a little bit dated, but that's what you see. It's interesting because I've been doing now thinking a lot about fragipans and their role on runoff generation. You're kind of thinking of it as continuous feature, almost like a pavement, but they're not impermeable. They perch water in places, but water can move through them. And there's been even work out of Penn State. Miguel Kamen and Rick Day had a soil block. They took a soil block with a fragipan in it and rotated around and looked at how much water moved laterally through it, how much water moved over top. And found that they actually do conduct water. 27% of the water moved vertically through it, and they had some fraction that ran off over top of it, and then other water was moving laterally through the fragipan. So they do conduct water. They're not these impermeable features. Mark Williams, who was a grad student that worked with me, and Kamini Singha and others that were on his committee, he went out. We were interested in kind of looking at these fragipan properties, and he used electrical resistivity imaging. Just to look at changes in the subsurface hydrology over time. And so the ERI is really sensitive to changes in moisture, so we're using it as kind of a proxy for water movement in the subsurface. And so we were looking at areas where there was a seep in the fragipan. We had groundwater seepage, and an adjacent area where there was no seep present, no visible seep. And so we had these ERI lines in these seep and non-seep areas. And so this is what we saw. This is the area without the seep, without any subsurface connectivity. And so what we saw during the wet-up period was basically perched water and it's somewhat disconnected from the subsurface. But when we moved over to the area with the seep, we saw really strong upward gradients indicated by our piezometers at different depths, and then those aligned really well with where the ERI was indicating a connection with the subsurface. And so to us, this just indicates that these fragipans, again, aren't continuous features. They have discontinuities. They've got they're anisotropic, so there's water that can move through them. And so now that I've been kind of looking at, going back and looking at some of our data, I used to kind of, when I first got here, naively thought that, we'd have interflow over these fragipans that would just keep going all the way down the slope. But there's been a lot of great work done, and you can't see the references below. Sorry, they're kind of cut off. But it's Julian Klaus and Rhett Jackson. Julian Klaus is a hydrologist out of Germany, and Rhett Jackson, they've done a lot of work on the coastal plain regions looking at and coming up with a formula to look at these downslope travel distances. And so they're just looking at this, the ratio of the saturated hydraulic conductivity of the area above a restrictive layer and the restrictive layer itself. And so when you have really big differences in the conductivity between the fragipan, let's say it's really low, and the layer above being really high, then you can get these long downslope travel distances. Interflow will move a long distance. But in contrast, when you have small contrasts, then water doesn't actually go very far. It actually percolates through and gets into groundwater. And so when we look at our watersheds, we find that Mattern and FD36 are much, much less than 10. And so these are just taking measurements we've made of the fragipan and of the layer above, the KSATs, basically, the saturated hydraulic conductivities. And so, again, it doesn't suggest that you have to be pretty close to stream to generate interflow that's going to connect with the stream. And that's, so as you kind of look at the things I present later, think about it in terms of connectivity. Like, you have to be pretty close to get water to actually connect with the stream, even in subsurface flow. And so that's kind of the point there. And so the kind of runoff generation mechanisms that we're interested in are, so in the upslope areas, we get infiltration excess runoff. And so that's basically need the rainfall rate to be much in excess of the infiltration rate of the soil. But again, there's usually localized occurrences of infiltration excess runoff that just move a short distance downslope and hit some kind of roughness or something else in the soil, and then will re-infiltrate. And then as you get closer to the stream, where we have these connected saturated areas, we can get what's called perch saturation excess runoff, where again you can have interflow moving along the restrictive layer that can exfiltrate, and then you can get saturation excess overland flow. And if you're close enough to the stream, you can actually connect in the time scale of an event. And so oftentimes I think it takes fairly large storms to really have these kinds of connections. Otherwise, you may even get saturation excess overland flow that then re-infiltrates and doesn't necessarily make it to the stream if you're far enough up the slope. So I think you have to be pretty close to the stream to get hydrological connectivity in the context of one storm. But we did a lot of, this is prior to me getting here, but I worked with these data that Pete Kleiman had set this study up, where we've got these different landscape positions with hill slope plots. Here's what they look like up close. There's small plots, 2 meters long by 1 meter wide. And the way they set it up, they had an open plot and a closed plot. The open plot was open to runoff from the entire slope, and the closed plot is bounded at the top. So it theoretically only generated runoff inside the plot. I'm only going to show the data for the open plots. There was a little bit of interest in looking at hydrological connectivity between the, so if you got runoff in an open plot and then runoff in an open plot above it, you could make some inference about, maybe there being runoff perhaps all the way down the slope. I think that's a real big stretch. So anyhow, I'll just show the results I show here are just from the open plots, but just to give you a sense of the kind of monitoring infrastructure that we use when we're measuring overland flow. And so what we saw was, most of the runoff in the upslope landscape positions was infiltration excess runoff. So we had subsurface saturation sensors aligned with these plots. And when they would saturate all the way to the surface, we would assume that was saturation excess. When they were saturated well below and we got overland flow, that was the presumption was that was infiltration excess overland flow because there wasn't any saturation at the surface. So most of what we saw in the upper landscape positions was infiltration excess, and then what we saw near the stream where we had a lot of saturation was saturation excess overland flow, or at least it was attributed to that mechanism. And quite a bit more, total volume generated near the stream than up the slope. So then the question was, well, how does this type of, these different patterns that we see in runoff generation, how do they interact with field management, and what does that mean for phosphorus loss? And so here you can see the different soil P concentrations that we have up the hill slope. Malic 3 concentrations of 78 parts per million down near the stream. That's about agronomic optimum, what you would need for growing a crop. And then further up the slope where these fields, the top two fields, periodically had fertilizer applied and manure applied. They had higher phosphorus concentrations. And so what we did was, first we just looked at what's the average dissolved phosphorus concentration in all the events that we captured over the 3 years that we monitored, and how does that relate to the soil P concentrations that we see. So here's the relationship that we get. And it's interesting to kind of compare the slope of this relationship, 0.04, with what Pete Buda noted in his runoff box meta-analysis of all the runoff box studies that have been done across the country, either in the field or in the lab. And this is just looking at the controls of soil P on dissolved phosphorus and runoff. So this is what he found. And so what we had was kind of a mixture of phosphorus losses due to applied, like manure or fertilizer, mixed in with events that were truly just liberating soil P. And so we have kind of a mixture of incidental and legacy P losses. So what we tried to do was factor out what we thought were incidental losses from the record. So here's just an example of what the data looked like from the mid-slope position, where you have these real big spikes. We have pretty detailed field management data, so we could confirm, or we felt pretty strongly that these were due to incidental transfers, and that if we took those out and focused on what we thought was being caused by legacy P, we could kind of apportion the legacy load and the incidental load. And so that's what we did. And if you do that, you end up with a slope that looks more like this, where this is just looking at the slope of what's being caused by, or what we think is being caused by soil P alone, without the incidental transfers taken into consideration. And so that allowed us to come up with estimates of how much of the phosphorus we thought was coming from legacy, from soil P, and how much was being coming from applied P sources like fertilizer and manure. And so you find that, in the upper landscape positions where they do get a periodic fertilizer and manure, that there's some, even division between legacy and incidental phosphorus losses. But at the lower landscape position, which is mostly fallow, doesn't receive any fertilizer or manure, that's largely due to soil P and just a function of the volume of runoff that gets generated from that site. So even though the concentrations of phosphorus are really low at that site relative to the sites above, it's just the sheer volume of water is what's carrying the phosphorus and generating the larger masses of phosphorus loss. And so that makes that area what we call a critical source area of phosphorus loss. And you'll see this term in the literature quite a bit. Andrew Sharpley and Bill Gaburick helped, and Harry Pianki and others helped coin this term. This is what drives all of our phosphorus management. Basically, the phosphorus index, which is this tool that we use, looks at, tries to come up with the effects of P sources like soil P or manure P, and then factor in the risk of transport. And so where those two align, where you have fields where there's a high risk of phosphorus transport and high phosphorus concentrations, and those areas are deemed riskier and get a little bit more attention in terms of management than fields that, where those two, well, you could have a lot of phosphorus but no hydrology to move it, and then the risk of phosphorus loss is low. Or the converse, you could have a lot of transport but no phosphorus to move, and the same thing. So one thing I thought I'd kind of move into is just thinking about extreme events and legacy peat loss, because we've had a lot of extreme runoff events, even this summer, but even recently. And so I've been looking at our data kind of in the context of extreme rains and thinking about, what's the role of extreme rainfall and legacy peat losses. And so, a lot of the work that's come out of Mantango Creek has also looked at just phosphorus export, and Harry Pianki and others did a lot of work early on looking at this. And it's a function of storm size. And so even though if you just tallied up the number of days with base flow and the number of days of storm flow, most of our flows would be classified as base flows. 10% of the flows in a given year might be storm flow, but then you look at how much phosphorus is coming in storm flow versus base flow, and it's mostly coming in storms. The few events in a year can drive the lion's share of the phosphorus loss in a given year. And if you're familiar with the National Climate Assessment, you know that there's a big uptick in extreme rains, particularly in the Northeast. And so this is just showing the heaviest 1% of daily events and the trend in those events across the Northeast. You can see a 55% increase in extreme rains. When we do that same kind of analysis with our rainfall data, we also see an uptick in extreme rain. So this is like a peak over threshold approach where you just look at what's the 99th percentile rainfall and then look at the trends and how much of that rain comes in that upper 1% of rains. And so we also see a trend in extreme rains in W38. And there's 2011, which was an exceptionally wet, extreme year. It included Tropical Storm Lee and Hurricane Irene. And so that's what I'll focus on real quick here is just, what happened there and how much phosphorus we got from that one storm. So here's kind of the run-up to Lee. So we were in a drought basically that summer. And Irene came along at the end of August and really, really wet things up. So you can see just the field, soil moisture reaching field capacity, but didn't really produce a whole lot of runoff. But then Tropical Storm Lee came along, and here's Mantango Creek sitting right kind of in the epicenter of all that heavy rain. We had 303 millimeters, 12, 13 inches of rain in about 4 days. And that was the fourth highest peak flow we've seen since we began monitoring in 1968. So we had a lot of runoff. Here's what that looks like in Mattern, which is one of the watersheds where we work. So you can see Lee's peak flow. Soil moisture plays a big role in these events. And so the fact that we had really, that Irene came along and wet things up, you can see that, the runoff coefficient, which is kind of analogous to maybe the fraction of the watershed that's producing runoff. Here's Irene, which occurred under fairly dry conditions when soils were below field capacity. And here's Lee, which occurred when things were fairly wet and produced a heck of a lot more in the way of runoff. So we were kind of fortunate. We've been doing a lot of hill slope monitoring here. Instead of using just simple runoff plots, we were actually using hill slope trenches. So we had very simple trenches that we had dug. We had gutters at different horizons. We had one at the AP interface, one at the BW and or BT, depending on what landscape position we were in, and one at the top of the fragipan. That was the goal, at least, and or the bedrock, where if we could get down to bedrock. We had tipping buckets to measure the flow rates and splitters to collect runoff samples, and then we were measuring overland flow over the same length, the same scale as the gutters. And here we were routing water through an HS flume instead of tipping buckets. And so again, here's the amount of, this is overland flow and then subsurface flow from the upper site, and then here it is from the site nearest the stream. This is just Tropical Storm Lee alone. And here's the amount of phosphorus that we lost. So you can see, again, quite a bit more near the stream, and kind of an even division between the amount of phosphorus we got in overland flow and subsurface flow. A lot of that was particulate P in this event. So we lost a large fraction of the phosphorus that came out of this event was particulate. Not surprising, given the amount of overland flow that was probably being generated. When you think about it from a watershed context, Lee generated about 6.1 kilograms of phosphorus just from that storm alone. As a fraction of the year in 2011, it accounted for 63% of the phosphorus loss, so 63% came from that one storm for the year. And then over the decade, if we just look at it kind of using Lee as kind of a midpoint, 2011 as kind of a midpoint, it was about 21% of the phosphorus loss came from that one storm over a 10-year time frame. And this mirrors quite well with actually what Bob Hirsch was showing for the Susquehanna River all the way down to Conowingo. Similar kinds of fractions, attributed to Lee in the Susquehanna, with somewhere on the order of 60%, in the Susquehanna came from that one storm, and 20-some% or so came from over the decade. So even though they're very different scales, similar kinds of findings, basically. And so in the context of phosphorus management, what would that mean? Bill Geberich and Andrew Sharpley, when they were here, spent a lot of time thinking about, the risk of phosphorus loss and storm size. And so they kind of used a very simple buffering approach. And we're basically saying that you typically would manage for the one-year storm. It's the most frequent storm, if you're trying to manage for phosphorus, if you focus on the one-year storm, you could focus most of your phosphorus management in this area confined by the 50-meter buffer. So you would do P-based management in those areas. In other words, you wouldn't apply any more fertilizer or manure than what the crops needed to grow. But Tropical Storm Lee is a much larger storm. If you looked at it in terms of discharge, it has a return period somewhere in the order of 73 years or so. And so that means, here's what, a 5-year storm might look like using their approach to the P index for Pennsylvania. They said, a 10-year storm, you might buffer 150 meters. So you're already now kind of thinking about the whole watershed really as being almost a critical source area, whether that's the case given how far we know interflow or overland flow might travel. You'd still be thinking this on an annual time scale, like the phosphorus index is used seasonally and annually to manage for phosphorus loss. And so really it means that you ought to be expanding your P-based management to larger areas to account for these kinds of extreme events, especially if we're going to have more and more of these events. And this was another year, 2018, where we had lots and lots of extreme rains in W38. I mean, we had days where we had several days in July where we had 5 to 6 or 7 or 8 inches of rain from these kind of training thunderstorms and things. So this is something you might want to start to take into consideration. Should we be managing for the one-year storm, or should we start thinking more broadly about where we do P-based management? So that's a little bit on sloping landscapes. I'll kind of shift into some of the work we've been doing down on the coastal plain. And the coastal plain, most of where we work is at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, which is in the Minokan River. So we have a long-running relationship with the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. We've been there since probably the late 90s. It's long, predates my arrival to the lab. But what kind of typifies this area is flat landscapes, lots of artificial drainage, poultry production. And so they, in any given year, about 600 million birds are raised on the Eastern Shore. That results in about 800,000 tons or so of poultry litter being generated, and a lot of that's applied locally. It doesn't go very far. There's not a lot of mechanisms to move that stuff off the shore, and so oftentimes it's applied very close to where the birds are raised. So it's led to a big buildup in legacy phosphorus. And so here's a map showing these are fertility index values, but they're analogous to Malic 3P basically, so you can read those in the same units, parts per million, Malic 3P. And so Somerset County, which is where UMES is located, has some of the highest soil P concentrations really on the whole Delmarva. I mean, you'll find places where it's over 1,000 locally, if fields at over 1,000 ppm easy. So it's an interesting place to work. One of the things that folks did before I got there was just look at, there's a lot of work now in drawdown, like how do we draw down these legacy P levels in soils? And so they had done a simple drawdown study for a period of about a decade, where they had some plots that they were doing basically only applying at the soil P requirement, so only what, actually there was no manure applied, sorry. And then the phosphorus-based is in the one in the middle. That's where they're applying just only what the crops need to grow, just based on P requirements for crops. And then N-based is kind of the traditional approach, and that ends up leading to more P being applied than what's needed by the crops. And so those were the replicated plots, and then here's the data for about a decade showing that there really hasn't been much change in P concentrations in soils. I mean, there's available P, which is Malic 3P, and then there's total P, and the total P concentrations can be thousands of parts per million. And those pools can change, but basically you're really not changing the amount of available phosphorus over that 10-year time frame, even when you're not applying any P. So some studies have shown it can be decades or even much, much longer before you could draw down through phytomining and other so just growing crops and not applying any P. So there's a lot of legacy P on the Eastern Shore is basically the take-home point there. And that leads to fairly high and persistently high concentrations of dissolved P in say, drainage or runoff and things like that. Another thing is just the role of artificial drainage. There's a whole lot of ditching, not so much in the way of tile drainage on the eastern shore. It's more artificial drainage ditches. But when with these features, you're lowering the water table. That's their point. That's the point of putting these ditches in. Typically, you're trying to lower it in about 24 to 48 hours after a rainstorm, so you can plant crops. And so, you dig them deeper. You lower the water table more. You can intensify by just increasing the spacing or decreasing the spacing between them, so more closely spaced. And so you lower water tables, that means water's moving faster in the landscape. The more of these you have, the more intense the drainage is, the faster the water moves. In fact, in the Midwest, there was a study showing that more intense drainage decreased the residence times of groundwater. So from a nitrogen standpoint in the Midwest, they're concerned about, well, you're flushing that stuff out faster, basically. Here, we're just moving water more quickly as either shallow subsurface flow, which has important implications for P transport. So these are some data from peat. Basically, when you have intense drainage, you have high soil P. Here's some of the phosphorus concentrations on the fields just around the farm. They're all over, most of them are over 400 parts per million Malic 3P. And these are the 8 ditches that we've been monitoring for well over a decade. These are some of the phosphorus losses that you can get. And this ditch 8 is, in part, the reason that those losses are so high is because there's a poultry barn here where they store litter, and locally around the barn, the concentrations are Malic 3 concentrations are like 1,000 or more. So it's like a point source, basically. But you can still have fairly high phosphorus losses from all these ditches. So it's a hook. And the sources of this is, unsurprisingly, is just like you've got high phosphorus concentrations near the surface. And so Pete Vadas did a groundwater survey around the farm, basically showing that you have fairly high phosphorus concentrations in groundwater that are tied to rain events. So you get leaching of phosphorus through the soils, and you get high P concentrations in groundwater. Those don't persist for very long. So shortly after a rain event, you basically move some phosphorus through macropores into groundwater, and then that can get flushed to the ditches if you're close enough to the ditch. But this is like point-based monitoring with piezometers, so it's like hard to infer connectivity with the ditches. And then Pete, around the same time, did a mass balance study where they were measuring overland flow at the edge of the ditch, and they were also measuring the loads in the ditches. And by difference, we're trying to calculate, well, how much phosphorus was coming in subsurface flow. And so what they were able to calculate is, since very little overland flow gets generated in these flat landscapes, the P losses in overland flow, the mass of P that they measured was very low. So most of it must be coming in subsurface flow. And so his inference was that somewhere on the order of 92% or so of phosphorus is being moved laterally in the subsurface, and that overland flow, unlike sloping landscapes, really isn't the big mechanism for moving P. But there isn't a whole lot of information on what those flow pathways look like. And so so the issue for a lot of phosphorus management on the eastern shore is that the phosphorus indices are pretty good with overland flow. A lot of them were developed in landscapes like in Pennsylvania. That's where the original phosphorus index was developed in FD36. And so, they used a lot of, rainfall simulation studies on sloping landscapes to figure out, what the role of overland flow is. But there's not a lot known about subsurface flow, and very little about, what these pathways look like. And so the phosphorus indices on the coastal plain really struggle with subsurface flow. They don't do a good job of really understanding where it's coming from and the risk of subsurface flow relative to overland flow, which they do better at. And so we came in and decided, well, let's try to try to understand a little bit better, like what's going on with subsurface flow on the eastern shore. And so this is work that is ongoing still. We're working with Lee Slater from Rutgers, their geophysics group, and trying to do some geophysical tracing studies to get a better handle on what's going on with subsurface flows and in the vicinity of these drainage ditches. And so we set up a very intensive site, right adjacent to one of the ditches on University of Maryland Eastern Shores farm, and we have 196 electrodes here, and we had detailed hydrological monitoring and an unattended monitoring site. We were just monitoring storms basically, and putting tracer. So a salt tracer, we were using potassium bromide, and we had a shallow trench that we dug just to put the tracer down and let rainfall activate the tracer. And we wanted to see where the tracer would go in the subsurface, like what that would look like. And we tried to capture as many different kinds of storms as we could. interesting when you're trying to do unintended monitoring. Oftentimes the best storms would come along and this thing would not work, and you'd be out there trying to fix it, and we'd have the grad student out there trying to fix and then it just got to be really frustrating. So I think some of the data that we ended up collecting had someone out there babysitting the thing the whole time, which, it's supposed to be like where you could be drinking your cup of coffee and letting this thing do its thing, and instead you're literally out there like checking the computer, checking the instrument, making sure nothing shuts off. So some of the biggest storms we unfortunately missed, but we were still able to capture, some interesting events. So here's one. This is the one I'll show you. And it's a small storm. It's a 1-inch rainstorm, fairly frequent kind of event that occurs down there. It's not an anomalous type of storm. But, you can see we collected ERI data near the peak, and I'll show you another data set that we collected kind of on the recession limb. So here's what that looks like. You can see the trench here. It's this big red spot. That's where the tracer is residing. And you can see that, early in the storm, like near the peak of the event, you get a lot of breakthrough of the tracer through this argillic horizon, which was originally thought that it would perch water, and it would move its interflow over top the argillic, and that's where it would be interacting with the high P. But we didn't see any evidence for interflow at all, or very little. It's really flat. So, and if you think about it, what I said earlier in terms of like the KSAT differences, they're not very different between the AP horizon above it and the argillic. So interflow is unlikely to move very far anyway. We calculated, just centimeters really as far as it would go before it would percolate through. And there's a lot of cracking. This is very, this clay type soil. So there's evidence for cracking in these soils. And so there's macropores and other types of preferential flow pathways that are evident, just by looking at the soils when you dig them up. And so what we found is that the tracer moved vertically through the argillic, and as soon as it got in the sand, it moved laterally in shallow, groundwater. And so that's kind of what we found. And so the other thing we were able to do is actually look at travel times of the tracer. So we could look at the center of mass of the tracer and see how fast it was moving. And so the travel times within, say, 3 to 5 meters of the ditch, you're looking at about a year. And this is during storms when water's moving at its fastest. You get further away, it's 1 to 5 years, and then you get deeper into the field, say 30 meters away, now you're into 10 years or more. And then if you're in the middle of the field, that's 40, 50, 60 years it could take. And that aligns pretty well with work that Sanford and others have done, like modeling groundwater flow throughout the Delmarva. The long travel times in shallow groundwater it's just really flat landscapes, water's moving really, really slow. So if the leaching pathway is to be believed, then I think you have to be pretty close to the ditch really to see, like within a meter or two, really on an event time scale to be, hydrologically connected. We actually interestingly found that during dry times that there was a reverse gradient away from the ditch into the field, and so really a disconnection between the ditch and the field itself. So you have to have these during the winter when it's wet is when we get any kind of connectivity where the field is actually contributing water to the ditch. So that's kind of what we observed. And during the biggest storms, the travel times could be less than a year, but you had to be just a few meters from the ditch probably for that to get there, and the time scale of either a long storm or several weeks of runoff. Some other work that we've been doing, this is kind of ongoing work. This is part of the same project where we're doing isotopic monitoring too. And so here we've been using suction lysimeters to look at mobile soil waters. We've been collecting bulk soil samples to look at bulk or less mobile waters. And then we've got piezometers all throughout the field. We're collecting groundwater samples, and this is to get a sense for the isotopic composition of shallow groundwaters. We're doing precipitation monitoring. We do it during storms. When we do it, and then periodically we're collecting bulk precipitation samples in the bucket there below. And then we're monitoring every event we can, with ISCO samplers during base flow, so just routine grab sampling during base flow, and then storms we're sampling along the hydrograph, trying to do both hydrograph separation and just long-term characterization of the isotopic composition of the waters. And these are preliminary, but this is kind of what we see. And this is using deuterium excess, which you can calculate from the O18 and deuterium data. We see that precipitation looks a lot like storm flow, so I guess that's not too surprising that most of the ditch drainage storm flow looks a lot like rainfall. We find that the mobile soil waters and the groundwater and the base flow look similar, so they're kind of derived possibly from the same sources. And then, unsurprisingly, the bulk soil water that we collect from the soils is the most evaporated and and really doesn't seem to be very similar to any of the other waters that we measure. So, we would probably conclude that, most of what we see during storms is coming from recent rainfall, and that's, perhaps the rapid infiltration that we see that's being reflected in the geophysics, and then, very short travel times to the ditch. So somewhere between 1 meter or 2 meters from the ditch is probably your critical source area for phosphorus loss on an event time scale, if we're, kind of interpreting these data correctly. So maybe just to conclude, more things we're thinking of doing down there. So thinking of trying to figure out ways to scale up. So working with Lee and his group on geophysical type measurements, trying to do a better job of characterizing the soils down there. And this is getting at really this idea of these critical source areas. We are pretty good at figuring out where critical source areas of phosphorus loss are. In sloping landscapes, they tend to be the wetter areas that we see. We can do that with topographic wetness indices and things, but there isn't really a good analog for the subsurface. And so we're trying to do a better job of look at soil properties with various kinds of geophysical tools. And so we've done some of this at UMES with induced polarization and EMI, electromagnetic induction, and University of Delaware has this Varus sensor that they can drag along with a tractor that gives us a sense for soil EC, the apparent EC. And it turns out, so we can generate maps like this, for example. This is looking at where the argillic horizon is located, this horizon that we thought was kind of involved in perching water and perhaps kind of shallow interflow. And that's the main reason we located our ERI site where we did. We wanted to try to characterize this feature. But if you go to the other part of the field, there's actually more conductive soil horizons, closer to the road that may actually be moving water. They might be moving the lion's share of the subsurface water. There could be faster transport pathways there that we're not characterizing very well with where we were located previously. And so the idea is to go there and try to do a better job of figuring out, well, maybe these are the critical source areas of phosphorus loss because these are areas that are more conductive to subsurface water. And so what we're going to do is, we hope, this is part of an AFRI grant that we put in, is to try to target these areas with plot scale type studies. We wanted to look at unsaturated zone transport. So we were thinking of using a labeled isotope in sprinklers and tracking the propagation of that isotopic tracer in unsaturated or beta zone flow. So we'd have suction lasimeters to collect the movement of those isotopes, isotopically labeled water, and then we'd pair that with geophysics, like a 2D geophysics looking at the wetting front movement in the Vado zone. And then further down, we were hoping to do some groundwater tracer studies, where we inject a tracer, but we're using more of a controlled storm event as opposed to relying on natural rainfall, which has kind of gotten us into some trouble. We just have a hard time capturing the ideal storm. So we're trying to manage this a little bit better. And so kind of in 2D, what you would do is you'd have an injection well, and you inject your tracer and then look at the propagation of this tracer. And we use multi-level groundwater samplers, which have been used quite a bit in studies of tracer transport in sandy aquifers, like in Cape Cod. There's these classic tracer studies that have been done. So if we were thinking of using these multi-level samplers and then trying to measure, in 3D where the tracer is going, and then we have the geophysics to kind of provide kind of corroborating information. And here's what that might look like in kind of a cross section. So this is work we plan to do with Lee and his group, we hope, in the coming years. And so I guess just to summarize, the traditional hill slope and watershed scale studies that we've been doing in sloping landscapes, basically show these hydrologically active areas near streams are really important to phosphorus loss. And the geophysical and isotopic studies that we've been doing on the eastern shore suggest, that there's this rapid percolation or leaching mechanism that occurs near ditches, and that a lot of what we see, we think, in terms of phosphorus loss on an event time scale at least, is happening within a couple meters of these drainage ditches. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and attention, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor for the various kinds of tools and techniques that we're trying to use, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you guys have. Did I go a little bit more than 45 minutes?
Pass the microphone around for questions. Do you have a question?
So if you have that rapid infiltration sort of all the way up, assuming it's sort of rapid vertically all the way through the field, and water is reaching groundwater or maybe towards the center of the field, farther away from from the drainage ditches. Is there then like interaction with maybe, so you had legacy P that was mobilized, infiltrated, does it then, is there like resorption that would occur?
Yeah,
Shallow
so
groundwater? Like, does the groundwater more of a buffer because it moves slowly?
the soils, yeah, they have the lowest phosphorus concentration, so there's likely sorption that occurs. And one thing I didn't mention is what we didn't do, that we hope to do, is actually, instead of just adding a conservative tracer, add a reactive tracer and look at the differential transport of a conservative tracer that's, not going to be subject to those kinds of sorption mechanisms, and then look at the movement of the reactive tracer. So a dissolved phosphate salt or something that we could put in there to pair it. That was one thing we didn't do that we kind of thought we might or should have done. And it's been done in other studies. Like Rhett Jackson did a really nice hill slope study where they injected various kinds of reactive and non-reactive tracers in a hill slope. It was a Piedmont watershed down in South Carolina, I think. And so that's something we might try to do this time around is get a sense for how far does the phosphate move relative to the conservative tracer, which is maybe giving you the maximum travel distances, but certainly doesn't move that far. There's definitely resorption that occurs. A lot of the tools that they use down there, it's like, leaching is often done with these column studies. So they'll just pull intact columns and bring them into the lab, and then that's how they get a sense for how much phosphorus might leach from these soils. And then they've got piezometers that they'll put around, and they'll measure high phosphorus concentrations in groundwater. But it really isn't a good continuum, between what they infer that comes out of the bottom of the lysimeter, which is maybe 50 centimeters deep, and then how that gets to groundwater, and then how that gets to the ditch. You kind of have these incomplete pictures of what's going on. I mean, there's definitely a big risk for phosphorus leaching from these soils because these, in particular, have macropores. Some other soils that are less finely textured don't have the same kind of preferential flow pathways evident in them like these do. Like these are really clayey soils. And if you go down in the summertime after it's been dry for a while, there's definite evidence of cracking. You get these big cracks that form. They're kind of ephemeral features, but when they're there, they transmit water to depth. So that's a pathway for either applied phosphorus if there's litter that's applied recently, or desorption of phosphorus from the high P soils into groundwater. But even what the piezometer data that has been collected in the past shows is that those high P concentrations in groundwater are ephemeral. They don't last very long. There's this little pulse that occurs, and then even Pete Bodis, even though he didn't have a kind of a continuum of data to look at, was inferring that most of what was happening was probably happening close to the ditch. If there was a source to be had, it was probably not very far from the ditch.
So I had a question about the sloped catchment, where you were arguing that as you increase the recurrence interval, the storm that's important, more and more the landscape sort of becomes a critical source area.
Yeah.
And I guess I was wondering, at some point, is there still a transition that happens where, even though the whole landscape is contributing, it's still the areas close to the drain, the axis of the drainage in the valley are still the most important. So in terms of how you actually, do you change your management style based on how much of the watershed is contributing, or is the fractions changing, or is the spatial distribution changing as well?
Yeah, I mean, the way they came up with that was just based on so these are just like simple kinds of exercises that they ran to, using return periods of storms and then trying to figure out if they could calculate like what the contributing area would look like given. So Bill used the length of the streams, and so he was using the blue line streams when they did this, and trying to basically come up with an estimate of how far from the stream would be contributing, just horizontally away from the stream. And so there's a simple exercise he ran through to come up with those distances. But I think in reality, the source areas are still pretty close to the stream. And as I'm starting to read the literature more on these downslope travel distances, for example, for interflow that don't seem to be very far. In fact, it actually seems more the norm that interflow doesn't go very far. And this paper was just published in Water Resources Research like a month ago. And there's other evidence that suggests that the sources for overland flow or subsurface flow are pretty close to the stream. So I'm trying to juxtapose that with what has been done in the past in terms of phosphorus management, suggesting that the entire watershed could literally be contributing, even in a storm like Lee, where its runoff coefficient for example, was 0.3, which you could infer that maybe 30% of the watershed then is actively generating runoff. That's not 100% of the watershed, and that's one of the largest storms we've seen. And so you're probably taking a conservative approach by imposing phosphorus-based management for the entire watershed, knowing that even the farthest away fields probably almost never contribute on an event time scale. But the phosphorus index is a tool that's run annually, so you're trying to account for the risk of phosphorus loss, over multiple seasons, and phosphorus is always kind of being moved incrementally down slope, over time. So even your furthest fields maybe don't contribute in one storm, but over time that erosion moves a little bit, some of that phosphorus further down slope, and then it moves it a little bit further, and so it could be something along those lines. But I understand what you're saying. I mean, to think of the entire watershed as contributing probably might be, based on some of the other evidence, like hydrologically, suggests even so that your areas close to the stream are probably still your hot spots for, at least for phosphorus loss.
It seems like the examples you gave were a lot about how variation in hydrology across this region is controlling phosphorus. Is there any mineralogical control? The last case had some depth, low phosphorus absorption at depth, higher absorption, lower concentrations at depth. Is there more of that across the broad scale where you have regions, you have absorption or high absorption because of variation in mineralogy?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, no doubt. And from a management perspective, I think what they've been toying with on the eastern shore is actually deep tillage to mix in, and now you're taking the really low P soils with lots of absorption and mixing them in with the high P soils and trying to reduce and so there's a study that Pete and Ray and some others have done. They've actually done, now they're looking at that ditch 8 actually, which has the really high phosphorus losses, and they deep tilled the whole field, trying to mix in those low P soils. So I forget how deep it went, but so that's kind of a strategy, right, is to potentially take advantage of that absorption capacity and to reduce the phosphorus losses that are occurring. But I haven't, those are the areas that I know the best, so I don't know mineralogically other areas, and how they might, certainly areas where you're applying a lot of phosphorus, it tends to be, near the surface, except where maybe we have leaching, and then you can move some of that phosphorus, to deeper. Depends on how you sample, actually. Yeah, I mean, so they've actually started sampling soils a little bit. Typically, an agronomic sample might be the top 6 inches or something, but now they're starting to sample in more fine intervals, and finding as you look at finer and finer, you still find that the absolute highest concentrations are that upper inch or upper couple centimeters of soil. So you can change your interpretation sometimes just by the way you sample the soils too. But yeah, typically the upper couple centimeters is where the highest peak concentrations are found. And so in areas where they have a lot of stratification because of the manure fertilizers applied to the surface, like they've done work in the Lake Erie watershed showing that the absolute highest concentrations in this thin veneer of soil, the upper couple centimeters of soil. And those are areas where a lot of it's broadcast on the surface. Another strategy to affect that is to inject the manure or the fertilizer, so then you're trying to get it into the subsurface, and you're just trying to reduce the risk of P losses and overland flow by injecting it. And so that's another management tool that you can use where you have a lot of stratification. You can either till it and mix it, which is somewhat of a problem, I guess, when we're in areas where there's no till, there's kind of a resistance to tilling, but that's a management strategy that could be employed to deal with highly stratified soils where you have all your phosphorus is near the surface. You can mix that in and try to reduce the risk of phosphorus loss by taking advantage of absorption at depth. No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, people probably have to leave because of the classroom day, but can you hang around a little bit and we'll ask you some more questions?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's thank him for the talk and people can leave. Thanks.
Sure, yeah. 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 Thanks. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Hey, John. Yep.
Like, obviously you're talking about long-term fertilization, and there's also pea storage in the soils. But is there any kind of best practice where they say we've got a lot of pea stored in these soils, let's stop putting pea onto the surface? Like, is that still usable by plants? Because that mainly 3 pea that you see in the soil, that's usable bioavailable phosphorus, right?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the phytomining work is kind of, that's just where you're not applying phosphorus anymore, and you're just letting plants to take it up, and then by harvesting and removing the pea, you're just theoretically taking pea off site, right? So a lot of the drawdown studies that have been done on the Eastern Shore are suggesting, many, many decades or perhaps even a century to draw that down.
So has there been any kind of like
So in theory, yes.
to say stop putting pea in the fertilizers because there's an incredible amount and it's available to use?
Farmers are basically still under the impression that the soil is kind of your bank for phosphorus. You just keep applying it, and it's just there, and you can kind of bank it, almost like you would like build up a bank account, right? You're just kind of building up storage. And so there's been a lot of social science research like about where farmers get their information from, and they get it less from extension and more from like fertilizer dealers. And those are the people that they're talking to. And so first thing is that, so they're still applying a lot of P because that's just the way they've done it, right? It's just kind of the way things have been done. Two, there isn't, so on the Eastern Shore, there just isn't a market really to move that stuff out. So they're trying to figure out like economically, how can we like get the litter off the shore, for example? Like we're growing the poultry here. Either A, we could figure out a different place to grow the poultry, or B, we need to figure out how to get the litter away, like further away. And there's a lot of places that could benefit from it because, it's got a lot of organic matter in it. It's a great source of nutrients. I mean, so if you could, and it's dry, so you can truck it. It's not like dairy or swine, which is loaded with water. It's like 98% water. And so that stuff's hard to move. But this stuff, there was a pelletizing plant that was down there for a while, and it's shut down now, but they were pelletizing it and selling the pelletized litter to, like to commercially, so you could buy it if you wanted to, but like bagged and stuff. But that's gone now.
I didn't think that pea was primarily from the litter from animals. I was thinking of it as being like source of fertilizer, but obviously that's totally
Well, they apply some of them will apply starter fertilizer of some sort. But yeah, the lion's share is the litter, and that's really the bigger story is that a lot of that's coming from feed from the Midwest. I mean, the lion's share of that is actually being grown in the Midwest, being shipped by train, to the animal growing regions of the East. So it's kind of a one-way nutrient transfer from the Midwest to the East. And so these livestock areas where you have these legacy pea, there's a lot of legacy pea that's been built up is because of this inefficiency in the way we do agriculture. So if we could fix that, send the manure back to the where they have pea deficiencies, you could close the cycle for pea. Or the other thing is, can you recycle it? Now there's a lot of interest in pulling pea out of soils and trying to figure out how to recycle it, because we put it in these areas like, so the Eastern Shore is just really leaky. These are all coastal plain wetlands, and now you've got all your phosphorus in these soils that are just really leaky and losing it almost all the time to drainage and. Yeah, so it's kind of a, long term. There was a lot of interest in the peak phosphorus story, which at first the peak was coming soon. Now it's maybe 300 or so years out. Yeah, so there's a lot of interest in figuring out how to, can we recover it? Can we recycle it? Can we do a better job of closing the cycle so we're not just mostly transferring it from one part of the country to another and then allowing it to build up in these areas like, in North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina, the Delmarva, the Lancaster, wherever you have these hot spots of pea.
But there has to be an economic thing that drives like how you're going to set it back to where the phosphorus basically came.
It doesn't seem to exist right now. That's not my area of expertise, but I read, you can, and Pete knows more about some of these issues. But yeah, that's the thing now is like, how do you fix this kind of broken cycle? But that's probably the story of a lot of our nutrients, right? These kind of broken cycles that we need to do something about. Nitrogen probably follows this somewhat similar, but it's more now we've got it in the atmosphere, you've got it in groundwater. So there's legacy and the soil, legacy nitrogen. So you're trying to deal with these issues, anyhow. So yeah. Is it Kurt?
Kella.
Oh, sorry. There was another person. You looked a lot like another person who.
Yes, I do look a lot like
Kurt McConnell, yeah. So, and I didn't mean it. I said Kurt before, and I really apologize for that because I've only met him once, and he needed to get some soils from our watersheds, and
It's funny because I do actually, don't worry about that at all.
so I apologize. My apologies. Yeah. So, but yeah. Anyways, you had and what's your name again?
Kella.
Kella.
Yeah, yeah.
Tony. Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
good
no,
to meet you.
thanks so much for the talk.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I'm doing work on nitrogen.